A second dome of high pressure is building over the western United States. It started forming on the 6th of July 2026, days after the first one broke apart over the East Coast. If this kind of steady report is useful to you, you are welcome to subscribe. Forecasters expect high temperatures 10 to 15 degrees above normal, with triple digits reaching from the Rockies into eastern Oregon and parts of California. These are the hottest readings the West has seen this season. The heat is landing on ground that is already burning. Federal fire managers raised the national preparedness level to 4 on the 29th of June, a step usually reserved for deeper in the summer. More than 3 million acres have burned nationwide this year, roughly 1.5 times the 10-year average. The coastline itself will mostly stay cool. The danger sits inland, east of the mountains and down the valleys. This report walks through the ridge overhead, the dry ground beneath it, the fires already running in Washington and Oregon, and the parts of the forecast that are still genuinely uncertain. On the 6th of July, a ridge of high pressure began to build over the western half of the continent. It arrived almost the moment the last one let go. For about a week, an enormous dome of hot air had been parked over the eastern United States and eastern Canada. It broke apart on the 5th. By the following morning, forecasters were watching a new one take shape on the other side of the country, over the mountains and the deserts and the valleys between them. A heat dome is a simple thing once you take it apart. High in the atmosphere, several miles up, there is a fast river of air called the jet stream. It usually runs west to east, and it separates cool northern air from warm southern air. Sometimes it stops running straight. It buckles and bulges north, and a big cell of high pressure settles into the bulge and stays there. Inside that high pressure, air is sinking. Air that sinks gets squeezed by the weight of the atmosphere above it, and air that gets squeezed gets hotter. That is the whole engine. It is the same warming you feel on the side of a bicycle pump after you fill a tyre. The sinking air also dries out, which means clouds have trouble forming. No clouds means nothing between the ground and the sun. No clouds also means no rain, and rain is the thing that usually breaks a hot spell. So the ground heats up, then it heats the air above it, then that air is trapped under the sinking air and cannot rise away. Day after day the heat accumulates rather than resets. That is why the 4th day of a heat dome is almost always worse than the first. The eastern dome that just ended gives some sense of the scale. Temperature records were tied or broken in cities across the United States and Canada. The highest reading was 106 degrees in Atlantic City, New Jersey, on the 4th of July. The power grid strained, trains slowed down, hundreds of thousands of homes lost electricity for part of it. As of the 8th of July, 44 deaths have been attributed to that heat wave. That number is likely to move, because heat deaths are counted slowly and often confirmed weeks later. Now the same machinery has set up over the west, and it is settling in over ground that is in very different condition than the east was. The jet stream is being pushed north as the ridge strengthens. That matters more than it sounds. The jet stream is what steers storms. When it lifts up into Canada, it carries the storm track with it, and the country underneath is left with clear sky and sinking air, and nothing coming in from the Pacific to interrupt. Forecasters expect that pattern to hold through the weekend and into the following week. There is one detail worth holding on to from the start. This ridge is not centered on the coast. Its core is expected to sit over the interior, roughly between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. That placement decides almost everything about who feels this and who does not. A dome centered over the Great Basin produces a very different week for Sacramento than for San Francisco, and a very different week for Bend than for Portland. The AccuWeather long-range team expects temperatures across the west to climb from a few degrees above the 30-year average early on to 10 to 20 degrees above it by the middle of the month. Their forecasters describe it as the hottest stretch of the season so far in the region, warmer even than the extreme readings recorded in Phoenix and Las Vegas and Palm Springs during the spring. That word forecast is doing real work in that sentence. Nothing described above has happened yet. What has happened is that the ridge began to build, the models agreed on its arrival, and agencies started issuing the first warnings. The rest is projection, and projections have a range. What is already true and confirmed is the ground. The West enters this week with the lowest snowpack ever measured, with drought across roughly half the lower 48 states, with the national wildfire preparedness level already raised, and with fires burning in Washington and Oregon that started over the holiday weekend and are not out. The heat is arriving on top of all of that. Where exactly it lands and how far it reaches toward the ocean is the first thing to sort out. Start with a line drawn from Billings, Montana, down through Salt Lake City, Utah, and into the deserts of southern Nevada. That is roughly where the hottest air is expected to sit. The core of this ridge is an interior story. Some of the most intense heat is forecast for the Rocky Mountain states, where daily records are likely to be tied or broken, and a handful of locations could come within a few degrees of their all-time highs. Billings is a good example, because the numbers there are concrete. Forecasters expect around 104 degrees on Saturday. On Sunday, the city could threaten its all-time record high of 108 degrees. Not a record for the date, and not a record for the month. The hottest temperature ever measured there, in any year, on any day. Parts of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas are forecast to reach near 105 degrees on Sunday. Move west from that core, and the picture changes by degrees rather than all at once. Widespread highs in the upper 90s and low 100s are expected on Saturday from the Rockies, across into eastern Oregon, and into parts of California. Salt Lake City is forecast to run from the middle 90s to near 100 through the week, then into the low 100s the week after. Denver sits in the low to middle 90s for much of next week, possibly upper 90s to near 100 by the following weekend. Now go all the way to the water, and something different happens. Areas right along the west coast are expected to dodge the worst of this. That is the National Weather Service position, and it is the position of the private forecasters as well. The shoreline stays comparatively mild. This is the part of the story that a map of red shading will not tell you, and it is the reason the title of this report needs care. A dangerous week for the West Coast is not the same as a dangerous week on the West Coast. The states are dangerous. The beaches are not. Consider what the Climate Prediction Center actually published in its probabilistic hazards outlook. Their forecasters wrote that there was a decent signal in the ensemble guidance for temperatures above 100 degrees across low elevation areas of the Great Basin and the Rockies, and possibly above 105 degrees across the California Central Valley for the 15th through the 17th of July. That is a moderate risk of extreme heat. Moderate is their word, and it is the middle rung of their scale. For the Pacific Northwest, the same outlook is more careful. The forecasters extended only a slight risk into the Willamette Valley of Oregon, where there are weak signals for temperatures exceeding 90 degrees. Slight risk, weak signals, 90 degrees, not 105. They noted directly that one model system pushes extreme heat much farther into the northwest, while the other keeps it cooler. So here is the map as the forecasters have drawn it. The hottest ground is the interior mountain west. The second ring is the California Central Valley, where the numbers may pass 105. The third ring covers eastern Oregon and eastern Washington, dry country east of the Cascade Range, where fires are already burning. The Willamette Valley and the Puget Sound lowlands sit at the outer edge, warm but not extraordinary. Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles are not, at this writing, where the worst of this is expected to go. That geography is not an accident of this particular week. It is the permanent shape of the region. The Cascade Range and the Sierra Nevada run north to south like a wall. Cool ocean air presses against the western side of that wall. East of it the land rises, the air dries, and summer arrives with a different temperament. Bend and Redmond and Pendleton have always been hot in July in a way that Astoria never is. What the ridge does is take that ordinary summer difference and push it further, and hold it there for days. The number attached to that push is between 10 and 15 degrees above normal, and by the middle of the month possibly more. 10 degrees does not sound like very much. It is worth understanding exactly what that shift does, because the answer is not proportional. 10 degrees above normal is a phrase that hides its own meaning. It sounds modest. It sounds like the difference between a warm afternoon and a slightly warmer one. What it actually describes is a shift of the entire distribution, and the damage from heat does not scale with the temperature. It scales much faster. A person cools themselves in one main way. Sweat forms on the skin, and as it evaporates, it carries heat away with it. That process works well up to a point, and then it stops working. It stops working when the air is too humid for the sweat to evaporate. It also stops working when a person runs out of water, or when the body is old or ill, or medicated in a way that blunts the response, or when there is simply nowhere cooler to go. Once cooling fails, core temperature climbs. The body responds by pushing blood toward the skin to shed heat, which pulls blood away from the organs that need it. The heart works harder. In a healthy adult, this produces exhaustion, dizziness, cramping, nausea. In someone with a weak heart or damaged kidneys, it produces organ failure. Heat stroke is the point at which the internal thermostat gives up and the core temperature runs away on its own. The single most important number in any heat wave is not the afternoon high. It is the overnight low. The body repairs itself during the hours when the air cools. If the temperature falls to 70 at night, most people recover enough to face the next day. If it stays above 75 or 80, they do not. Damage accumulates across days. This is why the third and fourth days of a heat event fill emergency rooms while the first day does not. Heat is the deadliest form of weather in the United States. It kills more people in an average year than floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, or lightning. It does this quietly, in apartments and mobile homes and parked cars, without wind damage or dramatic footage, and it does it mostly to people who are alone. That last detail comes up in every serious study of every serious heatwave, and it comes up again in this one. The forecast anomaly for this event, the 10 to 15 degrees, is applied to the hottest month of the year. That is the compounding problem. A 10-degree anomaly in April in Boise produces a pleasant spring day. The same anomaly in the middle of July produces a day above 105. The baseline is already near the ceiling of what the human body and the local infrastructure were built for. Infrastructure is the second thing that 10 degrees does. The Eastern Heat Dome, the one that just ended, broke the record for power demand on the largest electrical grid in the country. Trains slowed because rails expand and can buckle. Hundreds of thousands of customers lost electricity for part of it, which meant losing air conditioning during the hours when air conditioning is the difference between discomfort and hospitalization. The Western grid faces the same arithmetic with an additional complication. Hot air is thin air, and thin air carries less current safely. Transmission lines sag as they heat. Power plants that use river water for cooling lose efficiency when the river is warm and low, and the rivers this year are low. The National Weather Service has an experimental product called Heat Risk that tries to capture all of this. Rather than reporting a temperature, it reports the level of danger on a scale from green to magenta, taking into account how unusual the heat is for that place, how long it lasts, whether the nights cool off, and whether the health data show that temperature causing harm at that location historically. It exists because 90 degrees means something very different in Portland than in Phoenix. That is the point worth carrying forward. 90 degrees in a city where most houses have no air conditioning is a public health event. 100 degrees in a city built around air conditioning is an ordinary Tuesday. The Pacific Northwest sits in the first category. It always has. It was built for a mild maritime summer, and most of its housing stock still reflects that assumption. So the heat matters, and it matters unevenly. But heat alone does not burn 100 homes in a single afternoon. For that you need dry ground, and dry ground is not made in a week. It is made across a winter, and this last winter was the driest one ever recorded in the mountains of the West. In April, the snowpack across the western United States was the lowest ever measured. Not the lowest in a decade, and not the lowest since a particular famous drought year. The lowest in the record. 8 states set new record low values for what hydrologists call April 1st snow water equivalent. Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Wyoming. Each of those states measured, on the 1st of April, less water stored in its mountain snow than at any April 1st in the history of the measurement. Snow water equivalent is a plain idea with a technical name. Take the snow sitting on a mountain and imagine melting all of it in place. The depth of water you would be left with is the snow water equivalent. It is the honest measure. because snow varies enormously in density. 6 feet of light dry powder can hold less water than 2 feet of heavy spring snow. What matters downstream is the water, not the depth. The 1st of April is the traditional date to take that measurement, because in a normal year it is roughly when the mountain snowpack reaches its maximum. After that, the melt begins. Everything the West does for the rest of the year runs off that number. Reservoir managers plan around it, farmers plan around it, fire managers plan around it, because snowpack is not only a water supply, it is a schedule. Here is the part that connects the winter to this week. Snow does not simply vanish in the spring. It melts slowly, over weeks or months, and as it melts it soaks into soil and feeds streams and keeps the roots of grasses and shrubs supplied with water well into the summer. A deep snowpack in April is what keeps a hillside green in June. The melt is a slow release valve on the whole system. When the snowpack is thin, the valve opens early and closes early. The melt finishes in May instead of July. Soils dry out weeks ahead of schedule, streams drop, and the vegetation, which normally has a reservoir under it, runs out of water while the hottest part of summer is still ahead. The National Centers for Environmental Information noted this directly. As of June, the effects of missing snowmelt recharge were showing up in California, Oregon, and the Great Basin, especially in low stream flows. A late-season storm brought rain to southern Oregon and northern California, and improved conditions slightly in a few places. Overall, it changed very little. There is a phrase fire managers use for this condition. They say the fuels have an early start on the season. It means that the grass and brush and forest litter reach their summer dryness in June, rather than in late July, and every additional dry week after that pushes them further past where they normally sit. The consequence is that the calendar lies. Every experienced firefighter in the West knows what the second week of July usually feels like. This year, the ground under them is in a state they would ordinarily expect in the middle of August. The heat dome arriving this weekend is not landing on July fuels, it is landing on late summer fuels, 6 weeks early. Governor Tina Kotek of Oregon put snowpack first when she explained her state's emergency declaration in June. She listed extreme temperatures and dry vegetation and wind, and then she named the record-setting low snowpack, and then she noted that nearly half of Oregon's counties were facing persistent drought. That last word is doing something specific. Persistent. Not new. This is not a dry spell that arrived with the heat. It arrived a year ago and never left, and by the time the snow failed to fall, it had already dug in. The snowpack tells you what the mountains have. The drought monitor tells you what the ground has week by week, across every county in the country. The two numbers point the same direction, and the second one is worth reading closely. Every Thursday morning, a map is published that shades the United States by dryness. It is called the United States Drought Monitor, and it is put together jointly by the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska, the Department of Agriculture, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The most recent full national accounting, valid the 30th of June, found that about 48% of the lower 48 states were in drought. Roughly half the country. That is the headline number, and it is worth slowing down on what it counts. The map uses 6 categories. The first is not a drought category at all. It is called abnormally dry, and it describes land that is either heading into drought or coming out of one. After that come 4 drought categories, and they are ranked by how rare the conditions are compared to the historical record for that place. Moderate drought is the first, severe drought is the second, extreme drought is the third, exceptional drought is the fourth and worst, and it describes conditions in roughly the driest 2% of all years on record. The National Centers for Environmental Information describes that last category in plain terms. For an ordinary person, exceptional drought means a historic event, something expected once in 50 years or less often, with landscape-altering consequences, widespread crop and pasture loss, and severe water emergencies. Oregon offers the clearest picture on the West Coast. In early June, only about 4% of the state was free of dryness altogether. The rest sat somewhere on the scale. A large share of the state was in moderate or severe drought, and a meaningful piece of it had reached extreme drought. No part of Oregon had reached the exceptional category, which is worth stating plainly, because it is the difference between very bad and historically bad. Conditions have degraded in parts of California, Oregon, and the Great Basin since then, driven by the missing snowmelt and the low stream flows that follow it. Meanwhile, the Four Corners region, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, has been degrading faster than anywhere else, under repeated heat and no rain. What drought means for fire is not what most people assume. It is not primarily about the soil being dusty. It is about the moisture content of things that can burn. Living vegetation holds water in its tissue. A green shrub is difficult to ignite because the fire has to boil the water out of the leaves before it can raise them to combustion temperature. That process consumes energy the fire would otherwise spend spreading. A hillside of well-watered brush is, in a real physical sense, a firebreak made of water. Drought removes that water. The plants close down, cure, and turn from green to tan, and their moisture content falls from something like 200% of dry weight down toward the level of the air around them. At that point, they behave less like plants, and more like kindling that happens to be rooted in the ground. This is why the drought map and the fire map look so similar in July. The drought map is not really a picture of rainfall. It is a picture of how much water is still available inside the things that grow. There is one more piece of arithmetic here. Drought does not only make fuels drier, it makes them more available. In a wet year, the low areas near creeks stay green all summer and act as natural breaks that slow a fire down. In a drought year, those creek bottoms cure too, and the landscape becomes continuous. A fire that would have run a mile and stopped now runs 10 miles, because nothing along the way is wet enough to check it. That is the ground the ridge is settling over. Half the west is short of water. The mountains are short of snow. The creeks are low. And sitting on top of all of it is a specific kind of vegetation that behaves in a way most people find hard to believe until they have seen it. The Ryegrass Coulee Fire was reported shortly before 5 in the afternoon on the 8th of July, near the town of Vantage, Washington. Within a couple of hours, it had burned about 500 acres. It was not burning timber, it was burning grass. Grass is the fastest fuel on the landscape, and understanding why explains most of what happens in the West in July. Fire spreads by heating the fuel in front of it until that fuel reaches ignition. How fast that happens depends on how much material has to be heated. A blade of dry cheatgrass has almost no mass and enormous surface area. A flame touching it raises it to ignition almost instantly. A log has enormous mass and comparatively little surface area, and it takes minutes of sustained heat to catch. Firefighters sort fuels by how quickly they respond to changes in humidity. Grass, pine needles, and small twigs are called 1-hour fuels, meaning they gain or lose moisture in about an hour as the air changes around them. Branches an inch thick are 10-hour fuels. Logs are 1,000-hour fuels, and they take weeks of weather to dry through. This matters at 4 in the afternoon on a hot day. The humidity in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon under these conditions falls into the single digits and low teens. In the red flag warnings issued for Southern California in late June, the National Weather Service forecast humidity between 6 and 15%. Grass exposed to that air is bone dry within the hour. It does not care what the previous week was like. It responds to right now. Wind then does the rest. A flame front in cured grass, pushed by a 30-mile-per-hour gust, moves at a speed most people have no reference for. It can cross open ground faster than a person can run, and roughly as fast as a car can travel on a rough 2-track road. It also throws embers ahead of itself, which start new fires in front of the main one, which is how a fire crosses a road or a river that looks like it should have stopped it. The Ryegrass Coulee Fire appears to have been human-caused, and that is the ordinary case rather than the unusual one. In Oregon, on average, about 70% of wildfires are started by people. The common causes are unglamorous: debris burning that gets away, a campfire left warm, sparks from a chainsaw or a mower or a dragging trailer chain, a vehicle parked in tall grass, where the exhaust system sits a few inches above fuel that ignites at around 500 degrees. The National Interagency Fire Center reported 167 new fires nationwide on a single day this week. the vast majority of those were caught small, in what the agency calls initial attack. That phrase describes the first crews on scene, working to stop a fire in its first hours, when it's still measured in acres rather than square miles. Initial attack succeeds the overwhelming majority of the time. It is the quiet, unreported work that keeps most of these days ordinary. It fails when three things line up. The fuels are dry, the wind is strong, and the resources are already committed somewhere else. That last condition is the one that has changed this year. When crews and engines and aircraft are spread thin across a busy season, the fire that starts in the third hour of a busy afternoon waits longer for its first engine. And a grass fire that waits 20 minutes is not the same fire that it was. Fire managers in the Northwest have been describing this fuel situation since spring. The Oregon Department of Emergency Management put it in one word: tinderbox. The state entered the season with record-setting low snowpack, drought emergencies declared in county after county, and what the agency expected to be one of the driest seasons in more than a decade. They said all of this in May, before anything was burning. Which raises a fair question about what a state can actually do with a warning like that, and Oregon's answer arrived in the middle of June. On the 16th of June, Governor Tina Kotek of Oregon declared a statewide emergency over the imminent threat of wildfire. Nothing large was burning at the time, that was the point. An emergency declaration in advance of an emergency is a strange-sounding instrument, and it is one of the more useful tools a governor has. It does not describe a disaster, it unlocks a set of authorities. Under the declaration, state resources can move without waiting for the ordinary approvals. Agencies can be directed to support the fire effort. The Oregon National Guard can be readied, and money can be spent that would otherwise require a slower process. The governor listed the reasons in order: extreme temperatures, dry vegetation, windy conditions, low snowpack. She noted that Oregon had record-setting low snowpack, and that nearly half of the state's counties were facing persistent drought conditions. Then she made the point that state officials in the West return to constantly, and that outsiders tend to skip past. On average, 70% of Oregon wildfires are human-caused. That figure is not a scolding. It is a statement about where the leverage is. The weather cannot be adjusted. The snowpack cannot be replaced in July. Fuel moisture cannot be raised by wishing. But 7 out of 10 ignitions come from a person doing something ordinary, and ordinary behaviour is the one variable in the entire system that responds immediately to information. The declaration was timed to run through the fire season, its duration depending on conditions. Fire season is now formally in effect in every Oregon county, which brings with it burn restrictions that vary by district. Debris burning has been banned across many districts since the middle of May. The Oregon Department of Forestry has been unusually direct about consequences. If investigators can trace a fire back to a person, that person is responsible for the cost of the response, and may face lawsuits from landowners whose property burned. A spokesperson for the department, Jessica Nguyen, described the scale plainly. The cost of a large wildfire is not measured in thousands of dollars, it is measured in millions. Washington entered the season on a similar footing, though without a statewide declaration in June. The state's mobilization system does something related. When a local fire district is overwhelmed, the state fire marshal can authorize state resources to be sent under the Washington State Fire Service's Resource Mobilization Plan. The Chelan Hills Fire, which began on the 4th of July, was the 15th incident to receive state mobilization in Washington this year. 15 mobilizations by the first week of July is a number that says something without any commentary attached. Each one represents a local fire department that ran out of capacity. The pattern across both states is the same, and it is worth naming without drama. Officials saw the conditions developing in the winter, said so in the spring, prepared what they could, and then waited. There is no version of this in which the snowpack is restored or the drought is negotiated away. There is only the readiness of the system when the ignitions begin, and the behaviour of the people on the landscape. Both states also lean hard on one specific request, and it appears in nearly every official statement. Sign up for alerts. In Oregon, that is done through the state's readiness resources. In Washington and California, the equivalent systems run through counties. The reason officials repeat it is unglamorous. During the fastest moving fires, the difference between a safe evacuation and a dangerous one is often 20 minutes of warning, and 20 minutes is roughly the gap between an automated alert and a deputy knocking on the door. The state-level picture is only half of it, though. Wildfire in the United States is managed as a national system, with crews and aircraft and incident management teams pooled and sent wherever they are most needed. That system has its own thermometer, and it reads on a scale of 1 to 5. On the 29th of June, at 7:30 in the morning Mountain Time, the National Wildland Fire Preparedness level was raised to 4. The scale runs from 1 to 5. It is set by the National Multi-Agency Coordination Group, a body of wildland fire representatives from each federal agency, based at the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. The level is not a measure of danger to the public. It is a measure of how much of the country's firefighting capacity is currently spoken for. At level 1, geographic areas handle their own fires with local resources and little national support. Conditions are not favourable for significant fire activity in most of the country. At level 2, active regions may need some national help, but capacity is stable. At level 3, resources must be moved between regions to keep operations running. At level 4, in the language of the agency itself, national resources are heavily committed. Crews and aircraft regularly travel long distances. National priorities, rather than local ones, decide who gets what. Quiet regions face heavy demand to send their people elsewhere. Significant fire activity is happening in multiple geographic areas at once, and the potential for more suggests the demand will keep rising. At level 5, the highest, active regions must take emergency measures to keep operating, and the quiet regions are drawn down to their minimum staffing. Level 4 is the second highest reading on the scale, and it was reached on the 29th of June. The timing is the part that matters. Historically, the national preparedness level averages 2 during June and 3 during July. Reaching 4 in the last days of June puts the country roughly a full step, and something like a month, ahead of where it usually is. This does not tell you that any particular place is in danger. It tells you that if a new fire starts anywhere in the United States tomorrow, the pool of engines and hotshot crews and air tankers available to answer it is smaller than it would normally be. That is the practical meaning of preparedness level 4 for a person living in a valley in eastern Oregon. It is a statement about how long the first engine takes to arrive. The immediate trigger was significant fire activity across multiple regions at once, requiring a substantial commitment of incident management teams. Extremely critical fire weather was in place across the Four Corners region. 52 large fires were burning across 9 states when the level was raised. The elevation to level 4 also came in the same days as the worst news the fire community had received this year. 3 federal firefighters were killed in a burnover on the Knolls Fire, along the Colorado and Utah border. A burnover is what happens when a fire overruns the position of the people working it. It is the thing every part of the training system exists to prevent. The preparedness level system does not exist to communicate danger to the public, and it is rarely reported in the news. Its real function is triage. When resources are finite and demand exceeds supply, someone has to decide which fire gets the air tanker. At level 4, that decision moves out of the local district and up to the National Coordination Center, which weighs threats to life first, then critical infrastructure, then property, then everything else. The people making those calls are looking at a scoreboard that updates every morning in a document called the Incident Management Situation Report. It is dry, unadorned, and it is the single most honest account of the American fire season that exists. This week's numbers are worth reading. The report from Wednesday, the 8th of July, opens the way it always does. National Preparedness Level 4, then the tallies. 167 new fires reported since the previous morning. 6 new large incidents. 5 large fires contained. 37 uncontained large fires still burning across the country. 11 complex incident management teams committed. Then the seasonal accounting, which is the number that puts this year in context. So far in the calendar year, 37,783 wildfires have burned more than 3.4 million acres across the United States. That is 130% of the 10-year average number of fires and 146% of the 10-year average acreage. Read that as a sentence rather than as statistics. The country has had about a third more fires than usual by this date, and those fires have burned about half again as much land as usual. More ignitions, and each one running further before it stops. The report breaks the country into geographic areas, each with its own preparedness level. This week, the Great Basin area, which covers Nevada, Utah, and southern Idaho, sits at level 4 on its own, with 17 large incidents and roughly 394,000 acres burning. That is where the fire is concentrated. The largest fire in the United States right now is the Babylon Fire, 25 miles southwest of Monticello, Utah, at just over 100,000 acres. Utah has taken the brunt of the season so far. In one recent week, fires consumed more than 400,000 acres in the west, mostly in Utah, accounting for more than 70% of all wildfire acreage burned in the country to date. The West Coast areas read differently, and this is the part worth attention. Northern California is at preparedness level 2, with one large incident and about 570 acres. Southern California is also at level 2, with one large incident and 21 acres. The Pacific Northwest area, covering Oregon and Washington, is at level 2 as well, but with 10 large incidents and nearly 45,000 acres burning. So the 3 West Coast regions have not yet moved to a high, individual preparedness level, but they are pulling personnel. The Pacific Northwest has roughly 900 people assigned. Northern California added more than 240 people to its fires in a single day this week. Here is the situation described plainly. The national resource pool is heavily committed, mostly to fires in Utah, Colorado, and the Great Basin. Fire activity in the Pacific Northwest has begun climbing, with 10 large fires burning, and the hottest air of the season is forecast to arrive over that region within days. Independent fire trackers watching the Northwest have described it in the same terms, calling the region an emerging hotspot of the season. As of the 5th of July, 41 large fires were burning across 14 states. None of this predicts a catastrophe. Most fire seasons that start badly do not end badly, and most large fires are stopped by crews doing unremarkable work at 3 in the morning. What the numbers describe is a system operating without slack, in the week when the heat is expected to peak. To see what that looks like on the ground rather than on a spreadsheet, it helps to follow a single fire from the moment it started. One began early on the 4th of July, on a hillside in Douglas County, Washington, about a mile north of a small town called Orondo. Orondo sits on the west bank of the Columbia River in Douglas County, Washington, in orchard country north of Wenatchee, across the water from the road that runs up to Lake Chelan. It is a small place surrounded by steep brown hills. Early on the 4th of July, a fire started about a mile north of it. It was named the Chelan Hills Fire. By Monday, it had grown to roughly 10,000 acres with 0% containment. Aerial tankers and scooper planes worked the flanks through the holiday, dropping water pulled from the river below. Multiple agencies responded, and statewide resources were activated. It was the 15th fire to receive state mobilization in Washington this year. Fire officials said the fire jumped roads and drainages as it moved. Estimates put its size between 15 and 20,000 acres, with at least 100 structures destroyed. Evacuation orders went out for Orondo, for Chelan Falls, and for the Chelan Hills area, and the sheriff's office read out the affected roads by name: Chelan Hills Acres Road, Beatty Way, Jackson Canyon Road, Riverview Road, Canyon View Drive, Rocky Road, Big Ranch Road, Spring Lane, Kingbird Lane, Farnham Lane, Spur Lane, High Corner Road. Governor Bob Ferguson posted on the 4th that his thoughts were with the people affected and the firefighters working to contain it, and asked anyone in the area to follow evacuation orders. The terrain explains a great deal about why this fire behaved the way it did. Douglas County east of the Columbia is a landscape of coulees, which are steep-sided dry canyons carved by ancient floodwater. The hillsides are covered in bunchgrass and sagebrush and cheatgrass, cured to tan by early July. Coulees function like chimneys. Heat rises up them, preheating the fuel above the flame front, and a fire that starts at the bottom of a drawer arrives at the top of it far faster than it crossed flat ground to get there. 0% containment, which sounds like failure, usually is not. Containment measures the share of the fire's perimeter that crews have secured with a line they believe will hold. On the first day of a fast-moving fire in steep terrain, crews are almost never building perimeter. They are doing point protection. That means standing in front of individual houses, wetting roofs, clearing what fuel they can, and moving on when it becomes untenable. The perimeter comes later, when the wind lies down. The 4th of July is the single most predictable bad day in the American fire calendar. Fireworks are the obvious reason and not the only one. Millions of people drive into dry country and park in grass. Campfires multiply. Fire departments run at maximum call volume for other reasons. California banned personal fireworks outright in cities including Los Angeles, San Diego, and Long Beach. Cal Fire warned that illegal fireworks cause burn injuries, spark wildfires, and carry criminal penalties. Whether fireworks started the Chelan Hills Fire has not been established, and it would be wrong to say so without it. What is established is that a fire started on the morning of the 4th in fuels that had been curing since May, on ground that had come through the driest winter on record, in a county where nearly everything that grows is grass. 100 structures is the number that stays with you. Behind it are households sorting through what an insurance policy will and will not replace, and a county fair season that will proceed anyway, and the specific work of rebuilding fence lines so that livestock can be turned back out. But the toll from this fire is not only measured in structures. Over the weekend, one resident in the fire area was reported missing. On Monday, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office confirmed that they had found a burned car that had gone off the road. Human remains were inside. The coroner's office continued working to positively identify the person. That is nearly all that has been confirmed, and it is worth resisting the urge to fill in the rest. What is not known is when the car left the road, or whether the driver was leaving or arriving, or whether they had received an evacuation notice, or whether the road ahead was already closed. Those answers may come, they may not. What can be said, carefully, is why this specific kind of death happens in this specific kind of fire, because it happens often enough that fire agencies structure their entire evacuation philosophy around preventing it. A person in a vehicle feels safe. A car moves at 50 miles an hour and a fire in most people's imagination does not. That intuition is correct in timber and wrong in grass. A wind-driven grass fire crosses open ground faster than most people believe, and it does not need to catch the car to stop it. It needs only to reach the road. Once smoke crosses a road, visibility drops to a few feet. A driver slows, then stops, because they cannot see the shoulder or the ditch or the oncoming vehicle. Other cars stop behind them. In hill country, the road often runs along the bottom of a draw, which is precisely the terrain the fire is running up. Power poles burn and fall across the pavement. This is how the road, the fastest route out, becomes the least survivable place in the landscape within a period of about 10 minutes. The official guidance that follows from this is unglamorous, and it is the same across every state agency in the West. Leave early, not when the fire is visible, when the warning arrives. That is what a level 2 evacuation notice is for. It is the notice that says nothing is burning near you yet, and this is your window. Almost every serious after-action study of a fatal wildfire finds people who intended to leave and waited for one more piece of information. The second part of the guidance concerns what to do if the road closes anyway. Fire agencies teach that a vehicle is a poor shelter, but not a hopeless one. Stop in the largest cleared area available, away from vegetation. Keep the engine running. Close the windows and vents. Get below the window line and cover yourself with a wool blanket or a jacket, keeping away from the glass. The fire front in grass passes in a minute or two. Most vehicle fatalities occur outside the vehicle, from people who left it and tried to run. None of this is offered as a description of what happened north of Orondo, because that is not known. It is offered because it is what the agencies say, and because reports like this one exist to pass that along accurately at the moment it is relevant. The Chelan Hills Fire is one incident among 10 large fires currently burning in the Pacific Northwest. It received attention because it destroyed homes and because a person died. Most fires do neither and get no attention at all, which is a distortion in how any of us understand the risk. The Washington State Patrol, the county sheriffs, and the state fire marshal spent the following days in a rhythm that had become routine. On the 7th, the National Weather Service in Pendleton issued a red flag warning for the lower Columbia Basin of Oregon and Washington, for dry and windy conditions producing critical fire weather Tuesday afternoon and evening. Any fire that develops, the warning read, will catch and spread quickly. The next afternoon, one did, about 50 miles west of there, in a town of 54 people. The Ryegrass Coulee fire started at about 4:51 in the afternoon on the 8th of July in Kittitas County, Washington, west of a town called Vantage. Vantage sits where Interstate 90 crosses the Columbia River, roughly 10 miles north of the Gorge Amphitheater. According to the census taken in 2020, 54 people live there. The fire was reported shortly before 5. By early evening, it was about 500 acres. The Kittitas County Sheriff's Office ordered a Level 3 evacuation, which in Washington and Oregon means go now for the entire town. Deputies went door to door helping people leave. The Sheriff's Office described firefighting activity happening throughout the town, which is a phrase that means engines were parked between the flames and the houses. At least one structure burned. Power lines came down and contractors worked to make them safe. The Washington State Patrol reported heavy smoke along the Old Vantage Highway, reducing visibility, and asked drivers to slow down. Interstate 90 was closed eastbound at exit 115 in Kittitas and westbound in Grant County, which meant the main east-west highway across the state was cut in both directions at the river. At 7:45 that evening, the State Patrol authorized state firefighting resources under the mobilization plan, at the request of Kittitas County Fire District 4. The local district had reached its limit. Late that night, the sheriff's office reduced the whole town to a Level 2 evacuation, meaning be ready, and residents were allowed to return home. The fire was around 600 acres and still active. Officials warned people coming back to stay away from downed lines. Parts of Vantage expected to remain without power for at least part of the night. Eastbound Interstate 90 reopened at milepost 115. The fire appears to be human-caused. Look at the timeline. Ignition at 4:51, 500 acres and a full town evacuation within roughly 2 hours, a state mobilization request in under 3. That is what cured grass, low humidity and afternoon wind produce. And it is worth understanding that nothing about this fire was extraordinary. It was small. It burned one home rather than 100. Under this year's conditions, that outcome is close to the routine one, and the routine is the point. Notice also what did not happen. The evacuation worked. Deputies reached the doors. The interstate was closed rather than left open with drivers pushing into smoke. Nobody died. State resources arrived within 3 hours of a district asking for them. This is the system functioning under load, and it functioned because 500 acres in Kittitas County did not have to compete with 3 other fires in the same county on the same afternoon. That is the margin that Preparedness Level 4 describes, and it is the margin that the coming weekend is expected to narrow. 2 fires now, both in eastern Washington, both in grass, both within 5 days. Neither is among the largest in the country. Both required outside help. And to the south, across the state line, a 3rd fire has been burning for the better part of a week on ground that belongs to a sovereign nation with its own emergency management, its own evacuation orders, and its own reasons to watch the sky. East of Pendleton, Oregon, the North Chaos Fire has been burning for the better part of a week. It started small, in grass and brush on rolling ground, and it grew the way these fires grow, in surges on hot afternoons and hardly at all overnight. Early estimates put it between 2,300 and 2,500 acres. By midweek it had reached 4,663 acres, with 12% containment. Level 3 evacuation orders, meaning go now, were issued on the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Crews worked to protect structures and to keep the fire from pushing into Bachelor Canyon. As conditions improved, the orders east of the city were stepped down to Level 1. Flight restrictions went up over McKay Reservoir, which is standard practice because a single private drone in the airspace grounds every helicopter and air tanker working the fire. 12% containment on a fire that size after several days tells you something specific. It is not a measure of how much of the fire is out. It is a measure of how much of the perimeter is held. 88% of the edge of that fire is still line that crews either have not built or do not yet trust. In terrain like this, a containment line is often a strip of bare dirt cut by a bulldozer or scraped by hand, wide enough that a flame front arriving at it has nothing left to burn. Building it is slow, and building it near canyons is slower, because the ground is too steep for machines and too dangerous to put people below a fire. The Umatilla Reservation covers a large area of Umatilla County, and the tribes maintain their own emergency management, their own fire response, and their own relationship with the federal system. When a fire crosses onto tribal land, jurisdiction becomes a working question that must be answered quickly by people standing next to each other on a road. In practice, an incident like this runs under unified command, with the tribes, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and county fire districts sharing one incident action plan and one set of objectives. The fire also sits close to Pendleton, a city of about 17,000, and to the highway corridor that runs through it. Structure protection near the wildland edge is a different job from fighting fire in the open. It is done house by house, and the decisions are made in minutes. Crews look at the roof material, the vents, the vegetation within 30 feet, and the escape route behind them, and they decide whether the house is defensible. Sometimes they decide it is not, and they leave, and that is a decision made to keep firefighters alive. 2 other Oregon fires from the same week are worth listing for scale, because they show what the ordinary week looks like. The Antelope Creek Fire started on the 4th of July just north of the small Wasco County community of Antelope, grew past 1,200 acres in grass and brush, and prompted a Level 3 evacuation for the town. It reached 80% containment within days. The Coiner Fire near Redmond was held to 20.5 acres. 20.5 acres. Somebody caught that one in the first hour with an engine and a hand crew, and nobody outside Deschutes County will ever hear about it. And that is what a functioning fire season sounds like. Across the state line in Washington, the Crawford Oaks Fire in Klickitat County reached 90% containment after triggering Go Now evacuations and closing State Route 14 along the Columbia River. What all of these fires have in common is smoke, and the smoke is now the story for communities nowhere near the flames. Health officials have reported degraded air quality from the Columbia Basin across into central Washington, and asked residents, particularly anyone with asthma or heart or lung conditions, to limit time outdoors. 10 large fires are burning in the Pacific Northwest. Together they have covered nearly 45,000 acres. The area sits at preparedness level 2, which is to say that the Northwest is still handling itself, still drawing on its own crews, and has not yet become the place the country sends its aircraft. Whether it stays that way through the next 7 days depends on the weather and on the choices of a few million people spending a hot weekend outdoors. It also depends on how quickly people move when they're told to, and in Oregon and Washington, that instruction arrives in 3 words that mean something exact. Be ready, be set, go now. Oregon and Washington share a 3-level evacuation system, and it is worth learning before there is any reason to use it, because the whole design assumes you already understand it when the phone buzzes. Level 1 is be ready. It is shown in green. It means a wildfire is burning somewhere in the area and you should prepare. Pack the bag, check your emergency contacts, look at the vehicle, the fuel gauge, the medications. Make sure the people around you who will need extra time, older neighbours, anyone with a disability, anyone with livestock, are thinking about it too. Level 2 is be set. It is shown in yellow. It means significant danger, and it means you should be prepared to leave at any moment. Voluntary evacuation is encouraged at this level, especially for anyone who needs longer to move. This is the level that fire agencies most want people to take seriously, because level 2 is the window. It is the last comfortable moment. Level 3 is go now. It is shown in red. Leave immediately without gathering belongings. The wording used by the Oregon Department of Emergency Management is blunt. Emergency responders may not be able to assist further. Check the state travel information line or the highway department for evacuation routes. Washington uses the same 3 levels with the same names. California uses different language, warnings and orders, but the logic is identical. The go bag is the second half of the system, and it exists so that level 3 requires no decisions. Officials recommend 1 for every member of a household, including animals. Water, 1 gallon per person per day, with a 3-day supply for evacuation. Food that needs no preparation, again 3 days. Medications, and a written list of them along with the relevant medical information. Copies of documents, whether printed or on a phone or drive. Proof of address, insurance policies, birth certificates, a paper map because cell service is among the first things to fail. The parts people forget are the parts that matter later. Wildfire is not covered by a standard homeowner or renter policy. Neither is flood, and neither is landslide, and the landslide part is not academic, because burned hillsides slide in the first winter rain that follows. Oregon officials ask residents directly to check with an agent and confirm they have enough coverage to rebuild, not merely to be reimbursed for what was left standing. There is a further recommendation that sounds excessive until you read the fine print of a large fire. Officials recommend planning for 2 weeks, not 3 days, if you are sheltering in place rather than evacuating. A wildfire that knocks out transmission lines can take power off a rural valley for a long time. The practical instructions for evacuation itself are simple and consistent across agencies. No more than 1 way out of your neighbourhood, because the obvious route is the one the fire is most likely to cross. Do not wait for a knock. Take the pets when you leave, because you will not be allowed back for them. If you have livestock, understand that trailering horses takes hours you will not have. Once you're out, do not return until officials say the area is open, and that includes the day after, when the fire looks finished from the road and hot ash is still buried under 6 inches of soil. For heat rather than fire, the guidance is different and equally standard. Stay out of the sun during the afternoon. Drink water before you feel thirsty. Never leave a child or an animal in a parked car. Check on anyone who lives alone, particularly older neighbours, and check in person rather than by phone. Cooling centres open in most cities when temperatures pass a threshold, and libraries with air conditioning stay open. Anyone without transportation can generally call 211. The reason officials say all of this so early, and repeat it in a tone that sounds almost bored, is that they are trying to move the decisions to a day when nobody is frightened. Decisions made under smoke are poor. They also say it because they remember what happened 5 years ago, when the same region was told that a heatwave was coming, and the warning was accurate and hundreds of people died anyway. In late June of 2021, a ridge of high pressure formed over the Pacific Northwest and southwestern British Columbia and did not move. The mechanics were the ones described at the start of this report. A strong storm over the Gulf of Alaska pumped energy downstream and built one of the most powerful summertime ridges ever measured. Air sank, compressed, and heated. Soils were already dry from drought. The calendar sat near the summer solstice, which meant the maximum possible amount of sunlight falling on the ground each day. Portland, Oregon reached 108 degrees on the 26th of June. That broke the city's all-time record, which had stood since 1965. The next day it reached 112 and broke it again. The day after that it reached 116 degrees in a city whose normal high in late June is in the 70s, in a region where most homes had never needed air conditioning. Seattle reached 108 in a city where June afternoons ordinarily sit in the low 70s. Some Seattle suburbs went past 110. Forks, on the coast of the Olympic Peninsula, where the average June high is about 63 degrees, reached 110. Washington set a new state record of 120 degrees at Hanford. Oregon tied its state record of 119. Across the border in Lytton, British Columbia, the temperature reached 121 degrees, the highest ever recorded anywhere in Canada, and the town burned down in a wildfire the next day. The heatwave set or tied 128 all-time records in Washington and 116 in Oregon. Then the counting began. The Oregon Medical Examiner released records for 96 people who died of hypothermia in that heatwave. 72 of them were in Multnomah County, which contains almost all of Portland. Washington reported more than 100 deaths. Estimates for the whole event, including British Columbia, exceeded 1,400 people. Emergency department visits for heat illness in Oregon increased 63-fold. The pattern in those deaths is the thing to carry forward. The vast majority of people who died were indoors, in homes without air conditioning, and most of them were alone. They were not caught outside. They were not doing anything unwise. They were in their own living rooms, in a region that had never required them to think about heat, during hours when the temperature outside would not fall. Infrastructure failed alongside the people. Sections of Interstate 5 and State Route 162 buckled in Washington, and lanes were closed. In Portland, the heat exceeded the design limits of the light rail system, melting the power cables above the trains and shutting the network down for a day. Roughly a fifth of Washington's cherry crop was lost. Marine life died along the coast in enormous numbers. Researchers went back afterward and tried to place the event in the historical record. One study, using multiple climate models, concluded it was something on the order of a once-in-10,000-year occurrence, even accounting for a warmed climate. Other work found it would have been virtually impossible without human-caused warming, and estimated that continued emissions could make similar heat a once-in-5 to 10-year event in that region. The scientists were careful, and it is worth being careful with them. Their finding is not that the 2021 heat dome was caused by climate change in the way a match causes a fire. It is that an extraordinarily rare combination of weather features produced it, and that the resulting temperatures were higher than the same weather would have produced in a cooler world. The forecasts, notably, were good. The National Weather Service warned of an approaching heat wave several days out. Sub-seasonal guidance had shown an elevated likelihood of extreme heat with 10 to 20 days of lead time. Everyone knew. The knowing was not enough, and the reason it was not enough is the reason the next chapter of this report exists. The people who died in 2021 were not a random sample of the population. They almost never are. A senior epidemiologist with the Washington State Department of Health, Rad Cunningham, described the failure afterward without excuses. They saw it coming, he said, and did not have enough coordination to get ahead of it. That is an unusual thing for a public official to say out loud, and it turned into a considerable amount of work. The risk factors for dying in a heat wave are well established. Age is the largest. An older body sweats less, feels thirst less reliably, and often carries heart or kidney conditions that heat makes worse. Common medications compound it. Diuretics, taken by an enormous number of people for blood pressure, increase fluid loss. Some psychiatric medications interfere with the body's ability to regulate temperature at all. Living alone is the next factor, and in the Oregon records it appears again and again. A person living with someone else gets noticed when they stop making sense. A person living alone does not. Then there is housing. The Pacific Northwest built its homes for a maritime climate. Small windows, tight construction, no air conditioning, upper floors that trap heat overnight. Dense urban neighborhoods with little tree cover and a great deal of asphalt run measurably hotter than leafy ones a mile away, and they stay hotter through the night because pavement releases the heat it absorbed all day. Researchers in Portland studying the deaths from that heat wave were specifically interested in whether people died in buildings and on blocks that hold heat and cool slowly. Outdoor workers form a separate category. Farm workers, roofers, construction crews, delivery drivers. They cannot leave the heat, and historically, they had little protection when they asked to. That last group is where the clearest changes were made. Washington's workplace safety regulator issued emergency heat rules. Oregon adopted permanent rules. Both require a defined temperature thresholds, access to shade, drinking water, cool-down breaks, and acclimatization periods for new workers, because a body that has not worked in heat for a week is far more vulnerable than one that has. Cities did other work. Portland began a program to provide heat pump cooling devices to low-income residents. King County developed a heat mitigation strategy. Seattle drafted a heat action plan and started delivering air conditioning units to senior centers that lacked them. Public health agencies started sending heat messaging days ahead of the temperature rather than during it. Some of that worked. When another heat wave hit the region the following summer, health officials could see in their own data that the earlier messaging was reaching people, and the death toll, while real, was far smaller. The planning was incomplete. It was better than nothing, and nothing was what had existed before. This is the useful part of the 2021 case for the week now beginning. The Pacific Northwest is no longer a region that has never experienced dangerous heat. It has a memory now, and institutions built out of that memory, and a population that has been told, correctly, that 95 degrees in Portland is not the same as 95 degrees in Sacramento. It is also worth stating clearly what the current forecast does and does not resemble. The Climate Prediction Centre's outlook for the middle of this month places only a slight risk of extreme heat in the Willamette Valley, with weak signals for temperatures above 90 degrees. 90 degrees is not 116. Nothing in the present guidance suggests a repeat of that event, and saying otherwise would be dishonest. The reason to tell the story anyway is that the interior valleys in the eastern half of both states are not covered by that reassurance, and neither is the California Central Valley, where the guidance points above 105. And there is a geographic reason the coast keeps getting spared, which has almost nothing to do with luck. Stand on a beach in Northern California in the middle of July, and the water will be around 55 degrees. 55 degrees in the middle of summer at the latitude of Rome. That cold water is the reason the West Coast is not experiencing the week the rest of the West is experiencing, and the mechanism behind it is one of the more elegant things in physical geography. Winds along the West Coast in summer blow from the north, down the coastline, driven by the same high pressure sitting off the Pacific. Because the Earth rotates, moving water in the northern hemisphere is deflected to the right of the wind pushing it. That means the surface water along the coast is not pushed south. It is pushed offshore, away from the land. Water pulled away from a coastline has to be replaced. It is replaced from below. Cold water rises up the continental slope from a few hundred feet down, water that has not seen sunlight and has been cold for a long time. This is called upwelling, and it runs all summer. The result is a ribbon of very cold ocean pressed against a very warm continent. Warm, moist air passing over that cold water cools from below, its moisture condenses, and a low deck of cloud forms a few hundred feet thick and hundreds of miles long. That is the marine layer. It is why San Francisco has fog in July, and why Los Angeles mornings in June are grey, and why the beach town is 50 degrees cooler than the valley 20 miles inland. When a heat dome builds over the interior, the pressure difference between the hot inland valleys and the cool ocean actually strengthens. Air flows from high pressure to low, and the low pressure is now over the baking valleys. So the marine air gets pulled inland through every gap in the coastal hills, through the Golden Gate, through the Columbia River Gorge, through the low passes. The coast stays cool precisely because the interior is hot. This is the physical reason forecasters say that areas right along the coast will dodge the worst of this heat, and it is not a prediction so much as a description of how the system works. The shoreline is air-conditioned by an ocean, and the harder the interior heats, the harder the ocean pulls. There are limits, and they should be named. The marine layer is shallow. Rise a few hundred feet above sea level, or move 10 miles inland past the first ridge, and you are out of it. The relief is measured in miles, not counties. A person in Oakland is in a different climate from a person in Concord, and both would call themselves West Coast residents. In extreme events, the mechanism can break. During the 2021 heat dome, a coastal thermal trough set up and drove offshore winds from the interior toward the coast, warming as they descended. That is how the town of Forks, on the wet coastal edge of the Olympic Peninsula, reached 110 degrees. The ocean did not stop being cold. The wind simply stopped coming from it. Nothing in the current forecast points that way. The expected pattern is the ordinary one, with the ridge centred inland and onshore flow persisting at the coast. The cold water also does something less comforting. It is a reason so much of the interior is dry. Air that crosses cold water and then rises over the Cascades or the Sierra Nevada drops what moisture it has on the western slopes and arrives on the eastern side wrung out. The rain shadow that produces the sagebrush country of eastern Oregon and eastern Washington is manufactured by the same cold ocean that keeps Seattle mild. So the coast is comfortable and the interior burns, and both facts have a single cause, which brings up the one thing the interior sends back across the mountains. Under a strong ridge of high pressure, the air a few thousand feet above the ground can be warmer than the air at the surface. That arrangement is called a temperature inversion, and it is upside down from how the atmosphere normally works. Ordinarily, air cools with height, which is why mountaintops are cold, and why a warm bubble of air near the ground can rise. Rising air is how the atmosphere cleans itself. Smoke, dust, and exhaust are carried upward and away, mixed through miles of sky. An inversion stops that. A warm layer aloft acts as a ceiling. Any parcel of air trying to rise into it finds itself cooler and denser than its surroundings, so it sinks back down. Everything released below the ceiling stays below the ceiling. AccuWeather forecasters expect exactly this to develop beneath the heat dome. Light winds, a stable layer overhead, and a considerable amount of wildfire smoke trapped over the interior west, producing what they described as a substantially broad area of poor visibility. That is what the coming week is likely to look like for a great many people who will never see a flame. 10 large fires burning in the Pacific Northwest, more in the Great Basin, a lid clamped over all of it, and days of accumulation with no wind to flush it out, and no rain to wash it down. Health officials from the Columbia Basin across central Washington have already reported degraded air quality this week, and asked people with respiratory conditions to limit outdoor exposure. The hazardous part of wildfire smoke is particulate matter, and specifically the fraction of particles smaller than 2.5 micrometers across. For scale, a human hair is about 70 micrometers wide. Particles that small are not filtered out by the nose or the throat. They travel to the deepest part of the lung, cross into the bloodstream and provoke inflammation. The immediate effects are familiar: burning eyes, a scratchy throat, headache, a cough that lingers. For people with asthma or chronic lung disease, smoke triggers attacks. For people with heart disease, the risk is quieter and more serious, because that inflammation makes the blood more prone to clotting, and hospitals see heart attacks and strokes rise in smoky weeks. Children breathe more air per pound of body weight than adults do, and their airways are still developing. Pregnancy, old age, and any existing heart or lung condition all raise the risk. The guidance is standard and undramatic. Watch the air quality index for your location. When it climbs into the unhealthy range, stay indoors, close the windows, and run air conditioning on recirculate rather than pulling in outside air. A cheap box fan with a furnace filter taped to the intake makes a serviceable air cleaner for one room. Cloth masks and surgical masks do essentially nothing against smoke particles. A properly fitted respirator rated N95 does work, and it must seal against the face to do so. Avoid hard exercise outdoors. Do not vacuum, and do not burn candles or use a gas stove without ventilation, because indoor sources add to what is already there. There is a cruel arithmetic in a week like this. The instruction during extreme heat is to open windows overnight and let the cool air in. The instruction during heavy smoke is to keep them shut. Households facing both at once without air conditioning are in a genuine bind, and this is precisely why cooling centres exist and why libraries stay open. A public building with filtered air and air conditioning solves both problems in one room. Smoke is also the reason the pilots go home. Aircraft cannot fly retardant missions in visibility that has collapsed. A fire burning under a smoke inversion loses its air support, and the ground crews lose the tool that most reliably slows a fire's head. Then the smoke shades the ground, cooling it slightly, and fire behaviour moderates a little, and the fire settles into a smouldering, creeping thing that is harder to kill and easy to underestimate. All of that assumes the wind stays down. The wind is the variable that decides almost everything, and this particular ridge may be unusually quiet. Wind is the difference between a fire and a disaster. Everything else about a wildfire, the fuel dryness, the temperature, the humidity, the slope, sets the conditions. The wind determines the outcome. It supplies oxygen to the flame front, tips the flames forward so they preheat the fuel ahead, and carries burning embers hundreds of yards or several miles beyond the fire's edge to start new ones. Nearly every fire that has destroyed a town in the American West destroyed it on a windy day. That is why the red flag warning exists, and why its wording is precise. The one the National Weather Service in Pendleton issued this week described dry and breezy to windy conditions leading to critical fire weather. The one issued for the Mojave and Death Valley in late June forecast gusts of 35 to 55 miles an hour with humidity between 6 and 15%. Not one condition, the combination. A red flag warning does not mean a fire is burning. It means that if one starts, it will not stay small. Here is the unusual feature of the ridge now building. Because a heat dome is a large area of high pressure, and because the pressure gradient inside it is weak, the winds underneath it tend to be light. CNN's forecasters made this point directly. Hot and dry conditions concern fire managers, but the gusty winds that fan flames are less likely during this particular stretch. That is a real and meaningful piece of good news, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than buried under qualifications. The qualifications still matter. Light winds are a regional average, and fires make their own weather. A large fire generates a column of rising hot air, and air rushes in at the base to replace it. That in draft can reach 20 or 30 miles an hour on a day when the regional wind is calm. When the column collapses, which it does in the evening as the atmosphere stabilizes, the downdraft slams to the ground and pushes fire outward in every direction at once. Firefighters die in those moments. Terrain wind is the second exception. Air flows downhill at night as it cools and uphill during the day as it warms. In the coulees of eastern Washington and the canyons of eastern Oregon, those daily slope winds run regardless of what the synoptic map shows. A fire in a canyon at 2 in the afternoon has all the wind it requires, and thunderstorms are the third. Wind under a thunderstorm has nothing to do with the pressure gradient. Outflow from a collapsing storm can hit 50 miles an hour and change direction completely, which is how a fire that was running north for 6 hours suddenly runs east into a community that had been watching it safely from the side. The National Interagency Fire Center specifically warned this week that new and existing fires may be fanned by outflow gusts up to 50 miles an hour. So the honest summary is this: the heat this week is expected to be more extreme than the wind. That combination produces fires that start easily, spread steadily, and remain catchable. The alternative combination, high wind on dry fuel, produces the fires that get names people remember. The absence of wind also means the heat itself gets worse. Wind mixes the atmosphere and moves warm air away from skin. Still air under a dome is what allows overnight temperatures to stay high, and what allows smoke to sit, and what allows fuel to bake. There is nothing static about any of this. Fire managers know that a weak pressure gradient in July on the west coast is a temporary condition, and they know what usually ends it. Moisture starts coming north out of Mexico. The thunderstorms arrive, which is the wildcard forecasters have been circling for a week. The North American monsoon is a seasonal reversal of the wind. For most of the year, air across the southwest flows from the west, off the Pacific and over the deserts. In the middle of summer, the land heats faster than the ocean. Low pressure sets up over the interior, and the flow turns to come from the south, carrying moisture from the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico northward. That moisture builds afternoon thunderstorms over Arizona and New Mexico, then over Utah and Nevada, then, in a strong year, up into the Great Basin and the interior northwest. AccuWeather's long-range team expects the monsoon to become active toward the middle of this month. The National Interagency Fire Center is already reporting isolated to mixed wet and dry thunderstorms, developing across northeast Nevada and northern Utah into the central Rockies. The phrase that should catch your attention there is dry thunderstorms. A dry thunderstorm produces lightning without producing rain at the ground. The storm is real, and the rain is real, but it falls into air so hot and dry beneath the cloud base that it evaporates entirely before it lands. This is called virga. What reaches the ground is lightning, and the wind from the evaporating rain, which is cold, dense, and fast. Lightning strikes the ground somewhere in the American West tens of thousands of times in a good storm season. In a wet year, most of those strikes land on ground that is damp and nothing happens. In a year like this one, a strike into cured grass or a dead snag starts a fire, and the storm that started it moves on without dropping enough water to slow it. Worse, dry lightning does not start one fire. It starts 20 across 100 miles of terrain, in the same afternoon, most of them in places without roads. Fire managers call these lightning busts, and they are the single event most capable of overwhelming a region's initial attack capacity in a day. A red flag warning issued in southern Oregon last month said it exactly. Numerous new fire starts could overwhelm initial attack. Some of these fires smoulder for days in a stump or a root before they surface. Crews call them sleepers or holdovers. A storm passes, nothing happens, and 4 days later, when the humidity drops and the wind picks up, 6 fires appear at once with no obvious cause. An AccuWeather meteorologist, Paul Buckingham, described how the pattern is expected to unfold. Initially, little rain may fall with the storms, and the risk of a lightning-induced wildfire may increase along with large dust storms. Then, as the monsoon expands northward, the dry lightning and the wildfire danger and the accompanying heat surge will push farther north into the west and into part of southwestern Canada. There is a second effect, and it cuts the other way. The moisture that arrives with the monsoon raises humidity, which slows fire spread and helps fuels recover a little overnight. It can drop real rain. It also tends to knock the temperature down because the clouds shade the ground. The same surge of southerly moisture that brings the lightning may take a few degrees off the peak of the heat. Forecasters at CNN noted this trade openly. The expanding heat dome may usher moisture into parts of the Rockies, which could tamp down temperatures and might also support thunderstorm development and lightning strikes. They said they would keep watching what the pattern change means for fire activity. That is a forecaster telling you honestly that they do not know yet. It is worth pausing on how much of this week's outlook sits in exactly that condition. Weather forecasts are not single predictions, they are collections of them. 2 major systems dominate global forecasting. One is the American Ensemble, run by the National Weather Service, known by the shorthand for its global forecast system. The other is the European model, run by an international centre in Reading, England. Each is run dozens of times with slightly different starting conditions, because the atmosphere is chaotic and a tiny error in today's measurement becomes a large error in next week's forecast. The spread among those runs is the uncertainty, expressed honestly. For this event, the 2 systems disagree, and the Climate Prediction Centre said so. Their probabilistic hazards outlook noted elevated chances of extreme heat across much of the western United States, and then immediately noted the uncertainty. The American Ensemble is much faster and more aggressive, particularly in pushing extreme heat into the northwest. The European model is generally cooler. Both begin to weaken the ridge in the second half of the period. From that disagreement, the forecasters drew a line. There is a decent signal in both ensembles for temperatures above 100 degrees across the low elevation areas of the Great Basin and the Rockies, and possibly above 105 degrees across the California Central Valley, supporting a moderate risk of extreme heat for the 15th through the 17th of this month. Because the American model pushed heat farther north, they extended a slight risk into the Willamette Valley of Oregon, where there are weak signals for temperatures exceeding 90 degrees. That is what an honest forecast sounds like. Decent signal. Possibly. Moderate risk. Slight risk. Weak signals. Every one of those words is doing precise work and none of them is decoration. The same hedging shows up elsewhere. CNN's forecasters wrote that hazardous extreme heat could shift into the central United States early next week as the dome expands, but that it will take a few days for forecast confidence to grow. Confidence, in that sentence, is a technical quantity. It refers to how tightly the ensemble members cluster. So here is the state of knowledge as this week begins. What is confirmed? The ridge is building. Temperatures across the interior west will be well above normal this weekend. Records will likely be tied or broken in the Rockies. Fires are burning in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. The national preparedness level is 4. The snowpack was the lowest ever recorded. Roughly half the lower 48 states are in drought. What is forecast and therefore uncertain? How hot the Central Valley gets in the middle of the month, whether meaningful heat reaches the Willamette Valley at all, when the ridge weakens, and how quickly, whether the monsoon arrives early enough to cut the heat, or arrives with lightning and no rain, or arrives with both. What is unknown, and will stay unknown, where the next fire starts. That is not a forecasting problem. About 7 in 10 ignitions in Oregon come from a person, and the location of that person on Saturday afternoon is not in any model. Uncertainty is not the same as ignorance. Forecasters knew about the 2021 heat dome 10 to 20 days in advance. The models were right. The word possibly in a forecast is not a weakness in the science. It is the science working correctly, reporting exactly as much as it knows. What models cannot tell you is how many people will be standing between the fire and the houses, and that number is smaller this year than it has been in a long time. Fighting wildfire in the United States rests on a small workforce of seasonal and permanent employees spread across federal agencies, state forestry departments, tribal fire programs, and county districts. At the center are the hotshot crews, 20 people, hand tools, chainsaws, packs. Their job is to walk into terrain that vehicles cannot reach and cut a line in the dirt between the fire and everything else. They work 16-hour shifts, sleep in the dirt, and do it for 14 days at a stretch. There are roughly 120 of these crews for the entire country. Around them sits everything else: engine crews, helicopter crews and repellers, smoke jumpers who parachute to remote starts, air tankers, which do not put fires out but lay retardant ahead of the flame front to buy the ground crews time, incident management teams, the 11 of which are currently committed nationwide according to this week's situation report, which handle the logistics of running what amounts to a temporary town of 1,000 people at the edge of a fire. At preparedness level 4, this entire system is being rationed. National priorities govern resources of all types. The quiet regions are stripped to supply the active ones. That is why Northern California added more than 240 personnel in a single day this week, and why the Northwest is running roughly 900, and why California sent firefighters and equipment to Colorado when Colorado asked. Rationing has consequences that arrive quietly. It is not that a fire goes unfought, it is that the second engine arrives at 40 minutes instead of 15, and by then a fire in cured grass has quadrupled. The workforce itself has thinned. Reporting from the Pacific Northwest fire community indicates that the United States Forest Service has lost nearly 6,000 permanent employees since early last year, and that fuels treatments, the prescribed burning and thinning done in the off-season to make future fires smaller, have fallen by about 35%. State officials and firefighter unions have raised concerns about both figures. Those numbers come from reporting rather than from an agency statement, and they should be held as such until confirmed. The direction they point is consistent with what state fire agencies have been saying since spring. The consequence of reduced fuels treatment is not felt in the year the treatment is skipped. It is felt 5 years later, when the fire arrives in a forest that still has 100 years of accumulated fuel on the floor of it. And then there is the cost that does not appear on any spreadsheet. Late last month, 3 federal firefighters were killed on the Knolls Fire, on the border between Colorado and Utah, when the fire overran their position. They were doing what everyone in that workforce does, in the same conditions this report has been describing, on ground that had not seen a normal winter. The national preparedness level went to 4 the following morning. There is a temptation, in reports like this one, to treat firefighters as a kind of weather, an impersonal force that either arrives or does not. It is worth resisting. These are mostly young people, many of them seasonal employees, drawn from the same rural counties that burn. The person who cut line above Vantage on Wednesday night lives somewhere near Vantage. This is also why every fire agency in the West spends so much of its budget asking the public not to start fires. It is not about liability. 70% of Oregon's ignitions are human-caused, and each one of those, in a season like this one, asks 20 people to walk uphill toward it. What the public can actually do this week is narrow, specific, and more useful than it sounds. Start with the ignitions, because that is the part of this week that is entirely within human control. Do not use fireworks. In much of California they are illegal outright, including in Los Angeles, San Diego and Long Beach, and Cal Fire has been direct that illegal fireworks cause burn injuries, spark wildfires, and carry criminal penalties including fines and jail time. In Oregon and Washington, restrictions vary by district, and many districts have banned all outdoor burning. Do not park a vehicle in tall grass. The catalytic converter under a car runs at temperatures far above the ignition point of cured cheatgrass, and this is a common cause of roadside fires. Check that trailer chains are not dragging, because a chain throwing sparks along a highway shoulder can start fires for miles. Do not run a chainsaw, a mower, a weed trimmer, or a grinder in dry vegetation during the heat of the afternoon. If work must be done, do it in the early morning when humidity is highest, and stay for an hour afterward watching for smoke. If burning is permitted where you are, which this week it very likely is not, check the burn restrictions with the local district first. Debris burning that escapes is among the most common causes of large fires in Oregon. Campfires. Where they are allowed, drown them, stir the ashes, and drown them again until the ashes cold to the touch of a bare hand. For the heat, the guidance is standard. Drink water throughout the day before thirst arrives. Stay out of direct sun between late morning and early evening. Never leave a child, an older adult, or an animal in a parked car where the temperature climbs above lethal within minutes. If your home has no air conditioning, find a public building that does, and go there during the hottest part of the day. Libraries and cooling centres exist for exactly this. They turn nobody away, and calling 211 will connect you to a list and often to transportation. Check on the people around you who live alone, and do it in person. That single act is the strongest intervention available, and it is the one the death records from the 2021 heat dome point to most clearly. A phone call reaches someone who can answer a phone. If you work outdoors, you're entitled to shade, water, and cool-down breaks under the workplace heat rules in both Oregon and Washington once the temperature crosses defined thresholds. Anyone new to outdoor work or returning after time away needs several days to acclimatise and is at elevated risk in the meantime. For smoke, watch the air quality index for your specific location, keep windows closed when it climbs, and run air conditioning on recirculate. A respirator rated N95 fitted properly protects against smoke particles. A cloth mask does not. For fire, learn the 3 evacuation levels before you need them. Be ready. Be set. Go now. Sign up for county emergency alerts because they arrive before a deputy does. Pack a bag now with water, food, medications, and a written list of them, copies of documents, and a paper map. No 2 routes out of your neighbourhood. Have a plan for pets, and if you have livestock, understand that trailering takes hours. When a level 2 notice arrives, leave. That is the entire lesson of the last decade of Western fire compressed into 3 words, and check the insurance. Wildfire is not covered by standard homeowner and renter policies, and neither is landslide, which is what a burned hillside does in the first heavy rain of the following winter. Oregon's emergency managers ask residents to confirm they hold enough coverage to rebuild, not merely enough to be reimbursed. None of this is exciting. All of it is what the agencies actually say, and it is worth having read it on a calm afternoon rather than under an orange sky. Which leaves the last question, which is what any of us should actually expect over the next 7 days. Here is the week, sorted honestly into what is known, what is forecast, and what is not known at all. Known and confirmed. A ridge of high pressure is building over the western United States, the second such dome of this summer. The western snowpack was the lowest ever measured, with 8 states setting record low values on the 1st of April. Roughly half the land area of the lower 48 states is in drought. The national wildland fire preparedness level has stood at 4 since the last week of June, a step usually not reached until later in the summer. More than 37,000 fires have burned over 3.4 million acres nationwide this year, about 1.5 times the average acreage for this date across the last decade. 37 large fires are uncontained. 10 of them are in Oregon and Washington. The Chelan Hills Fire, which started on the 4th of July, destroyed at least 100 structures, and human remains were recovered from a burned vehicle in the fire area. 3 federal firefighters were killed on the Colorado and Utah border. Oregon has been under a statewide wildfire emergency declaration since the middle of June. Forecast, and therefore uncertain. Temperatures across the interior west are expected to run 10 to 15 degrees above normal this weekend, and possibly 10 to 20 degrees above normal by the middle of the month. Daily records are likely to be tied or broken in the Rockies, and Billings, Montana may approach its all-time high. The Climate Prediction Center places a moderate risk of extreme heat across the low elevations of the Great Basin and the Rockies for the middle of the month, with the California Central Valley possibly exceeding 105 degrees. It places only a slight risk in the Willamette Valley, where the signal for temperatures above 90 degrees is weak and where the two major forecast models disagree. Winds beneath the dome are expected to be lighter than in a typical critical fire weather event. The North American monsoon is expected to become active toward the middle of the month, bringing moisture, some cooling, and the risk of dry lightning on fuels that have been baking for weeks. The ridge is expected to weaken in the second half of the period, though the models do not agree on when, unknown and likely to remain so, where the next fire starts. Roughly 7 in 10 Western ignitions come from people, and no model forecasts human behaviour on a hot Saturday. So the title of this report deserves a final answer, given plainly. By the measures fire managers and forecasters actually track, this is the most dangerous stretch the West has faced this season. The fuels are drier than the calendar suggests. The heat is the hottest of the year so far. The resource pool is thin. Those three conditions arriving together is what makes a bad week rather than a hot one. But the danger is not evenly spread, and the coast itself is not where it sits. The shoreline will stay cool, because the ocean beside it is cold and the wind will keep coming off it. The danger is inland, east of the Cascades, down the Central Valley, up the coulees of the Columbia Basin, and the winds, so far, are not forecast to be strong, which is the single most important reason not to expect the worst. Watch 3 things over the next 7 days. Watch whether the monsoon arrives with rain or with lightning alone. Watch whether the American model or the European one turns out to be right about the Northwest. And watch the preparedness level, because if it moves to 5, the country has run out of slack. We will follow this as it develops, and report what the agencies confirm as they confirm it. Take care of the people near you,